Hey everybody, I'm back, and you're all hopefully back, and I hope that it's been a good first couple weeks, judging by the discussion and exchanges in our two discussion boards thus far, the My Utopia and then the A Moment of Disruption, as well as the video workshops. This is the second of which so I should say video workshop. We've only had one. It's already, I feel like class is off to a great start. It's always hard to, feel connected when these online asynchronous scenarios, but seeing all the conversation and responding to the conversation, including the conversation in the Q&A, has really been a great way to get the class going. So this second video workshop, I'm going to get right to it to sort of save us as much time as possible. And our focus is going to be upon narrative strategies. We did the DB2, obviously a moment of disruption. We did that. And without really sort of going, as I said, in that assignment itself, going in cold, just I wanted you to bring what you knew before this class in terms of how to develop a narrative. If that was nothing, then that's perfectly fine. Diving in some cases is often the sort of best way to learn. You just sort of get on the bike, if you will, and see what happens. Obviously, we're going to take the time to build from here. So one of the goals of this video workshop is just that. Obviously, also to open up a space for us to ask questions and make points. So let me connect right to, and it might take me just a second, but I want to bring up the slides here. Should be sharing my screen here shortly. My computer has been less than fast as of late. Okay, so let me go ahead and get into slideshow mode here, and we'll get sort of started. So as you can see, the title of this video workshop is Narrative Strategies, which, as I mentioned, is going to be one of the key goals here, understanding what can we do to develop narrative strategies. We're in week 3, and so the learning goals are understanding personal narratives, to continue to develop our understanding of those personal narratives, as well as start to build strategies for building our stories. Now, I don't want to sit here and pretend like I have all the strategies or all the methods or all the tricks, or that we could even get to all of the methods, strategies, and tricks of writing personal narratives. So even if you're making something up on your own or from your own experience and trying to write personal narratives, it's great. I want to hear that. We all want to hear that. If you have different ideas about effective ways of developing personal narratives, those are things to say out loud in the bonfire discussion or even in these video workshops. So we've also taken a look at narrative or narrating, organizing, describing, and dialogue from the Norton Field Guide to Writing. And I'm going to be referring to that and to another reading that's in Perusal called Salvation and Speechless. It's 2 different personal narratives. One by a young woman, a high school student named Maria Fernandez, and another one by Langston Hughes, who you probably know or at least heard about already. We will also, this week, we'll be having invention posts. I'm not going to spend too much time here describing that because there's guidelines. But the goal of those invention posts is, in fact, that's the bulk of our work this week, is to spark ideas about a variety of methods and effects of personal narratives. And those who are doing invention posts, you may remember signing up for these at the start of class. If you didn't have a chance to sign up, I went ahead and put your name in. Josh, Christine, and BB will be doing it, creating posts by the end of Tuesday night. We'll all be replying as a class by the end of Wednesday night. And then Dylan, Cassandra, and Michael will be posting by the end of Thursday night, and we'll be replying as a class by the end of Friday night. So that's the core of the sort of assignments and activities that we'll be doing in this 3rd week. So let's dive right in on narrative strategies. So one question, which is always a good question to ask yourself, and you should always be questioning, why are we learning what we're learning? What am I going to get out of this? So why develop personal narrative skills? One thing I want to emphasize that I think it's far more than just a genre, right? That storytelling is a skill, it's a strategy, it's an ethics. It's obviously a form of communication that, first of all, can help us render information as meaningful in a wide variety of contexts. It's one thing take a look at the sort of local news, right? Or a news story, right? A news story isn't just a bunch of statistics and a bunch of data and then just a bunch of description. It usually is couched in a kind of narrative, right? Focusing in on a particular character or characters. And that allows us to become more emotionally connected to something. It renders meaningfulness out of the seemingly randomness of any particular situation. It involves creativity. It involves coordinating with others. You're thinking about audience. You're thinking about how to connect with your audience. It involves critical thinking. It involves emotional intelligence, right? In many ways, when you're writing a personal narrative, you're thinking about what it means to feel and what feelings are like and how they affect us. You're thinking about what causes certain feelings and how feelings often and emotions often aren't just simple things to understand. They are things that are very complex and complicated and difficult and challenging. Um, so in that sense, it helps us improve our critical thinking as well as our writing. I mean, I think, one of the questions, and this was, I think, came up in the Q&A, is sort of, how do I become a better writer? The traditional answer is read, read, read. And the reason why it's read, read, read is because if I can understand how various pieces of writing, excuse me, influence me and affect me. How is it that this person organized these words in such a way to have this effect? If I can understand how they did that, I can decode it, if you will. That's going to make me a better writer. I'm essentially training my instincts as a writer. Oh, okay, I know. So with an opening, so we're going to take a look at beginnings of narratives here. With a beginning, if I want this effect, I'm going to want to do this and this and this, or something similar, right? That is a way to not only improve our critical thinking, because it's teaching us to ask questions that are sort of secondary thinking, tertiary thinking questions, but also will ultimately help us develop our writing. Also engage an audience and build relationships, understanding the practice of empathy. In some sense, in writing a personal narrative, although it might sound strange, you're trying to have empathy with yourself. You're trying to remember, how did you feel? What was that experience like? But you're also thinking about other characters. You're also thinking about other people. You're also thinking about an audience. And I mentioned that already. How do I want my character to feel? Excuse me, how do I want my audience to feel? Right? How am I going to convey this thing in a way that doesn't just describe an emotion for my audience, but actually gets the audience to feel that as well, or something similar to that? And finally, it helps us develop our own individual perspective, style, our own individual voice. It helps us, it gives us those narrative skills, can really help us tell our own story. So whether you're in an interview, right? And somebody wrote their personal narrative. I can't remember off the top of my head. Somebody wrote their personal narrative about an interview. I think it was maybe Dylan. But it'll help us tell our story, whether I'm in an interview or whether I'm sort of, meeting somebody for the first time, whether I'm proposing, a particular idea that I hope somebody to sort of help support me with. Having those narrative skills can create meaning, can create a personal connection, emotional connection to things. Okay, so let's get into what is a personal narrative. Let's define what it is. Well, if we take a look at the OED definition, right, a personal narrative is a spoken or written account of connected events. A story. Okay, so most often, if we were asked the question, what is a narrative, we would say it's a story, right? That's the first thing. But what is a story? But the secondary definition, or a sub definition, that the OED gives is the narrated part or parts of a literary work as distinct from dialogue. Now that's kind of curious. I think we would all agree that dialogue is a part of a narrative. So how is it that, why separate it out? Well, I think there's just a couple things, and this is obviously just one dictionary's definition. But I think there's a couple things that this teaches us about how we can think about narratives from a formal perspective. That is, since we are in the business right now of trying to write a narrative, what are the things that I need to know formally in order to understand how to build one? One thing is that, we have this idea of connected events. So a narrative is built out of scenes, it's built out of moments, right? It's not an exposition, it's not a history, right? It's not this, then this, then this, then this, then this. You're maybe only pulling a few of those moments or a few of those scenes to tell that story. Just think of it as when you're watching a movie or something, or you're reading a novel, you're not seeing every single moment of that character's or that person's life, right? You are seeing very select moments. So in that sense, a narrative is always episodic. It's built out of scenes. And I implied that when I said with our DB2 discussion board, a moment of disruption, have an introduction scene, have a disruption scene, and have a kind of aftermath scene or a reflection scene. So it's episodic, it's scene driven. Now, the other thing is it says that these events are connected. So narratives have some sort of sequence or some sort of arc, right? And it's not necessarily chronological, right? As we saw and we'll take a look at in just a second, with the reading we did from the Norton Field Guide of Writing, it isn't just about, you know, this and this and this and this, a chronological, it can be, your story can absolutely be chronological. There's nothing wrong with that. But it has this sort of, often these scenes have some sort of emotional connection. They have a certain arc, right? And again, I implied that as well with the instructions on the moment of disruption, the DV2, when I said you have a setup, you have the disruption, and you have kind of an aftermath or a reflection. So it has that sense of an arc, it has that sense of sequence. And then the third thing, and I thought what we can take out of the separating away narrative from dialogue, I wouldn't trouble yourself with that too much. Dialogue is going to be part of our narratives. So, but I think what that tells us is that narratives have a certain style, right? They have a certain point of view. It's not just the events and the details and the dialogue, a narrative, right? It's also how those things are told. So when you think about, so one way to think about this is that, we will each tell the same story differently, right? So if I was going to tell the story of, my first day on campus, it's going to be quite different if somebody else told the story of my first day on campus, right? If I'm going to tell the story, or let's say an event that we've all shared, right? If I was going to tell the story of the pandemic, it's going to sound quite different. It's not even just going to be different from the way you would tell, but it's going to sound different. It's going to have a different tone, different style. Maybe I'll use a little bit of humor there, here and there. Maybe you would only have a very more serious tone. So I think the value of that sort of sub definition is that it's not just dialogue, right? If I'm just recording dialogue, those are the voices of other people usually, or the voices of the main character and the other characters. But a narrative has its own voice, it has its own style. So think about like the narrative in a documentary film or a live action film, right? The narrator often has this sort of distinct voice and becomes a character all their own. So a written narrative, a written personal narrative has its own style, its own point of view, or its notion of voice. So those are, I think, scenes, sequence, and style. Those are three things, the three S's, I suppose, are things we can keep in mind as we develop these narratives. Now, what makes for an effective personal narrative? The New York Times, and this is where Maria Benavides Fernandez, or Fernandez Benavides, I can't remember. It's funny, the story is about somebody getting her name wrong in some sense, and it's slipping my mind at the time too, so I apologize, Maria. But came from her story came from the New York Times hosts a personal narrative contest every year, and so they choose, I think like first, second, and third place, and honorable mention or something. So they actually give a description of how they choose their winners. Now, again, this is just one point of view, it's the New York Times, but I think it's also useful to take a look at this, give us a sense, again, of a couple of core principles that make narratives effective. So this is from the New York Times. They say the winners are selected because they had a clear narrative arc with a conflict and a main character who changed in some way. They artfully balanced the action of the story with reflection on what it meant to the writer. They took risks like including dialogue or playing with punctuation, sentence structure, and word choice to develop a strong voice. You're hearing all those things that we just talked about in the previous slide in here, huh? And perhaps most important, they focused on a specific moment or theme, a conversation, a trip to the mall, a speech tournament, a hospital visit, instead of trying to sum up the writer's life in 600 words. So their contest, it has to be a maximum of 600 words. So if we take a look at this, one thing is we get that sense of arc, a narrative arc, characters, conflict, transformation. By nature, the topic, right, our topic for our narrative is a moment of disruption. So that implies that there needs to be some sort of shift or change. As they say, a narrative has a conflict and a main character who changes in some way. Second thing here is that it took risks. It was playful, it was inventive, right? It wasn't just trying to sort of, state the facts, so to speak, just the facts, right? It was actually doing something. It had a sense of style, it had a sense of voice. It was inventive, it took risks. it did something that was a little bit different or unique that gave it its own distinct character. And then the third thing they say is it balanced action and reflection. And we'll talk a little bit more about this as we go forward. But when we think about it, we're going to have scenes and there's going to be external action. Things are going to be happening in the world. In combination with that, you obviously have point of view. So you're going to have a character who is thinking things, feeling things, seeing things in certain ways. So there's both external and internal kind of parts to a narrative. I mean, we can start to break that down. It's a good exercise, I feel, to go through your narrative, but try practicing on another narrative like Salvation or Speechless, or Felsenfeld's narrative at the start of the Norton Field Guide to Writing, and highlight all the things that you feel are external action, and then highlight all the things that you feel are like internal. It can be interior monologue, but it can also just be sort of things that are more subjective, that seem to sort of give a vibe of feeling or emotion, as opposed to things that are external. And you'll really get a sense of how there's a kind of tacking back and forth between the external world and then an internal feeling. So I think this description of the New York Times, criteria for what makes for a powerful narrative is really useful in that sense. Okay, so let's start getting a little bit more pragmatic and less theoretical. So how do we build our narrative from here? Well, one of the things that gets mentioned within the Norton Field Guide to Writing, the narrating, organizing, describing, and dialogue, is sequencing. So one thing we can think about is how to sequence our narrative, right? Most often we especially in a first draft, we'll sequence our narrative chronologically, right? Beginning, middle, end, younger to older, before, moment, after. And that's perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm not trying to imply that chronological stories aren't as effective as more randomly sequenced stories. Not at all. It's what you think is best for the way the scenes to come through. So thinking about sequencing can be interesting. And they mention a number, they being the Norton Field Guide to Writing, mentions a number of things like reverse chronology. So if you've seen like a film like Benjamin Button, it might be hard to think about a reverse chronology. I think they mentioned the example of a resume, how you often list the most recent things in a resume at the top and then go back in time. But like Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, you might be playful. You might play with the kind of sequencing of your own narrative. The use of flashbacks, like a story like Bullet in the Brain, which is a story by Tobias Wolff of a guy who gets shot in the brain, and sort of flashbacks through kind of, his life flashes before his eyes. Pulp Fiction, of course, is a film that sort of takes place an entire flashback. It starts in a cafe and then it picks up that cafe scene, which is a robbery scene, much later in the film. I like to call it out and back, so in jazz, and I'm not a musician and I'm not a musical aficionado, if you will. But from one thing I know about jazz is like the bass and the drums often are like the kind of spinal cord of a song, while the guitar or the trumpet or whatever can go off and do all the soloing. And then you always have somebody sticking to a certain rule or certain beat, like 12-bar blues, and then you have somebody riffing off of it. And it can also be kind of considered a kind of in the meantime format, which is to say that there's something that's consistently happening throughout the story. So I remember reading a story about, the story starts with this launch of this cruise missile, and then it cuts to like images of people living in this town, and a mother sort of getting their kids ready for school, and then another guy sort of delivering food around the town, and then we cut back to this cruise missile that's flying through the air. And pretty soon you quickly understand that this cruise missile is headed for this town, and you're reading about all this humanization of these people. Vito Acconci is a writer and an architect and everything. He wrote a story once about the moon landing. So he would have clips from the moon landing that would go on, and then we go into this detailed story of him walking his way through New York City to try and get to his lover's house. And the moon landing's happening as kind of this interesting contrast where you had this rule, this chronological rule, and then this kind of, riffing off of that as Acconci makes his way through New York City. You can use timestamps and markers, almost in the form of a diary is another way you can play with sequencing. Think of something like Goodfellas that's constantly giving you timestamps of different towns, the year. Actually, it's the month, the day, the year of all these different events that happen in the film, or something like a captain's log. You could have those kind of timestamps or markers. Thinking about depth, pacing, and timing, Italo Calvino was somebody who really played a lot with depth, pacing, and timing. There's a book I think called "If on a Winter's Night, a Traveler," and it just gives you the beginning of multiple different stories, and that's it. But the way in which you can really play with rhythm and repetition, you can create montage. You think about a lot of television series, you'll notice a television show often, a lot of them end with montages. You'll have this over narration and you have this clip of, especially if they have multiple characters, right? Sort of multiple main characters. I remember Scrubs did this. I don't know if you guys ever heard of the show Scrubs, but it's this television show about young sort of doctors in an emergency room. And so since there's multiple characters, it would always end with a montage of what they were doing at the end of the night or whatever, and have this over narration. So you can think about depth, pacing, and timing in terms of playing with that. That's part of sequencing too, even how you can sequence within a particular scene. Point of view, first person point of view, of course, is what we're most often going to be using in a personal narrative because it's I. Second person is you. Third person is they. So those are, you can engage pronoun shifts as you like. You can shift tenses, right? If I'm doing a flashback to the past, if I'm but most often I stay in the present tense. And you can even have the point of view of an object, right? Imagining what you look like from like a sky view, a helicopter view as you walk down the street, right? And you could even say, I imagined, the view for me from above, blah, blah. So think about point of view, and you can play with that point of view. And then also think about, in terms of sequencing, thinking about form, right? Maybe I want to write my story in the form of a letter or a step-by-step program, or in the form of a screenplay, or following the 7 deadly sins. So these are all things you can really sort of have fun with, get wowed with, in terms of the form and structure, the space-time, how your story plays with space-time, which is what sequencing is really kind of all about. How am I going to sort of connect these different scenes, these different moments, these different events? And again, chronological is just fine. Okay. Now, I'm not going to cover all of these different narrative strategies. I mean, we just talked about sequencing. But I want to focus in for this first video workshop, details and the use of details in stories and narratives, and the importance of details, and then also beginnings. How do we start narratives? What makes for an effective beginning to a narrative? So details. The power of narratives is the way in which they enact emotional responses from readers through the details of their characters, settings, and scenes, moments, right? So there's something I just want to point out here with this. This is kind of my own invented definition, borrowed from many other sort of definitions or descriptions of narratives, which is just that it's not about telling a story, right? You've heard that phrase, show, don't tell. And what that means is essentially that stories aren't in the business of simply telling something that happened, right? That's like a history, like we talked about before. Rather, stories are about gripping us or grabbing us, getting a hold of us emotionally, enacting an emotional response. That is where their impact and their power is. And much of that happens through details. So what kind of details are we talking about here? Well, the sort of core 5 are visual details. What does it sound like? Or excuse me, what does it look like? Second one is oral, meaning what does something sound like? What sounds are there? Tactile, what does it feel like? Aromatic, what smells are there? And then taste, what is the taste like? Now, it's not that you have to have all these details in every single scene in order for it to be an effective scene. No, you can certainly overload details into your story where it's just too much, right? So that's why you see above it says details, not details. You can certainly overload. So we want to not just flood our stories with details, but we want to sort of curate. Oftentimes early on, I write as many details as I can, And then I go back and I just only use a few, and we'll look at how a few well-placed details can really capture a kind of emotional response. But there's other kinds of details I want to talk about beyond these five. And I'm not saying these are all the possible details. These are just other ones that I thought of. And think about kinetic details, movements. How does something move? Silent details. What is the stillness like? Right? Quiet. The quiet is a detail that's hard to capture, but that can be really important or effective. Spatial detail, how close or far something is. Extrasensory, things that are beyond words. How do you describe something that's sort of there's no way to describe it? Metaphors or similes, right? So a metaphor is something more like a direct comparison, while a simile is when you say something is like something else. So you could say the moon is like a light bulb. Well, that's a simile. Or you could say the moon is a light bulb. That's a metaphor. Lists, you can create sort of lists. And Felsenfeld does this twice in his story. He lists sort of all the different artists he used to listen to as a young kid. I can't remember off the time. It was like David Bowie and I don't know, Missing Persons or something. But he also lists like the classical composers and classical pieces that he loves. He uses lists a lot as a form of delivering detail. Diction, lexicon, if there's particular slang language. You see in Salvation, Langston Hughes' story, he uses a lot of kind of religious language. These lambs and the 99, and he uses this language, biblical language, religious language, to sort of build out his story. Dialogue is a form of detail, right? It gives a sense of characterization, but dialogue also has a sense of immediacy. When we know something is being spoken, we have very much a sense of hearing that, right, in the moment. And then tonal shifts can be kind of details that subvert expectations. Those can be details, I guess you could say a detail of style, but where we really sense as a reader, this kind of shift in tone, right? We go suddenly from a really dark moment to a sort of more humorous moment. So those are the kinds of details we can think about. I want to take a look at a couple examples. Well, first, when to bring the detail, and then we'll take a look at a couple examples. Like I said, we can overload with details. So when do we want to bring them in? When we want to enact a sense of experience and create an impression upon our reader. It's our, in many ways, when I think about narratives, it isn't about me showing somebody a photograph, right? When I think about a narrative, there's an important part of giving only a limited amount of information to my reader, because I want my reader to build that world, to build that moment in their own mind, because that action of their own mind building it is what will make it powerful, right? So if I just described every single detail as closely as I could, it doesn't leave any room for the reader. I need to make sure to leave room for my reader to build that scene. So I want to give them just a couple of those key details. So, you know, when do I bring those details in? During moments of transformation, to sort of describe distinct or unique things that were there, to enact emotion, like I said, to get my reader to feel that moment a little bit more, to tighten characterization, setting and or scene, right? You can really capture the vibe of a place with just a couple details, right? Or the vibe of a person, a vibe of a character with just a couple details, right? Maybe that character always sort of smells like cigarette smoke and sort of, had a kind of really toothy smile, or maybe that person sort of had these big, wild eyebrows, and a voice that was really bellowing, right? So a few small details is often can really tighten characterization and make it much more effective. To provide a sense of immediacy, like I just said, so like a detailed dialogue, like I said, puts us there hearing that voice. And then sometimes you just use details when it makes too much sense or ties up too nicely. I remember I was really struggling with this end of the story, and I'm not going to go into it now, of course, in the spirit of time, but I had the ending where this young boy is sort of forced to learn kind of a sense of violence from his father. And so I didn't want to just say at the end of the story, right? And the boy knew then that he was capable of such violence. It just seemed too on the nose, right? It seemed to tie up things too nicely, right? So instead of that, I just had this detail of the boy drinking a glass of juice, and a fly ends up landing on the table near the cup, and he picks the sort of cup up, like leans it up, and the fly actually crawls underneath the glass, right? And then he lets the glass down and crushes the fly. And that's the end of the story. Now, that detail was, I thought, more engaging and more powerful and more open for the reader's interpretation than me saying, right, the young boy now understood that he was capable of violence. It's too direct, too on the nose, right? Not enough room for the reader. So those are some of the details, when to bring them in. So if we take a look at some examples, like I said, I was going to, this is a detail from Salvation. A great many old people came and knelt around us and prayed. Old women with jet black faces and braided hair, old men with work gnarled hands. So notice how we get that kind of sense of immediacy, right? But also really the sense of characterization. We can see these people through just, Langston Hughes just gives us these very specific details that, of the jet black faces, braided hair, the work gnarled hands, the kneeling. Those details really bring that scene to life, give it a sense of immediacy, and also really give us a sense of characterization. Um, this is from Speechless. This time, as I walked to the oratory final, I did so by myself, as I had finally acquired the self-assurance needed to navigate the quiet hallways of the school. So here we have the quiet hallways, and I could hear the heels of two girls behind me. So we just have that detail. Again, it's an oral detail here, something heard. Obviously, Langston Hughes using visual details of these kind of the heels, and we know that sound. We can feel that sound, and it brings those characters in some sense to life, even though it's a small detail. We know it's haunting. We know something bad's about to happen, and it has this sense of immediacy. Okay, so taking a look at a couple examples from the narratives that you wrote. I'm just bringing in a couple here. The temperature felt unimaginably high. It was quiet, almost as if Mother Nature was paying tribute to a life well lived. So we have this detail of the heat, right? And almost an indescribable heat. Like we talked about, those details, things are beyond words. And this sort of captures that. And notice how that feeling, this feeling of this meaning of paying tribute to a life well lived, of the importance of a life, um, um, is captured more powerfully by this idea of it being quiet. It's not just said directly per se. It is the quiet, the heat, Mother Nature, sort of almost communicating. Another one with the sterile smell of a doctor's office ramping up. So here we have that kind of smell-based detail, aromatic detail, as we sat there anxiously awaiting the cause of the silence. So here we have more silence. The doctor said the four words that would forever change the lives of not only me, but also my family. Your daughter has a penis, which has this moment of humor to it, right? We have this real intensity. Notice there's that tonal shift detail here. There's also the smell detail. There's also the dialogue detail. And we have this wonderful kind of shift. We have this tension with the setup. And then we have this moment of kind of shift or transformation. So we also get a sense of characterization from that of the doctor. Just a couple examples of details that I thought were really quite powerful and effective in the stories that we've written for this class. So moving forward, I want to talk about beginnings, and then we'll wrap up. So how do we start narratives? How do we begin them? And what comes with an effective beginning? Well, taking a look at Speechless, right, we begin with this kind of mispronunciation of Maria's name. So her name is Maria Fernanda. There we go. So Marfier, the tournament judge called squinting her eyes, trying to find the spelling error, although there was no error. It's Mayfer. It's a nickname for my full name, Maria Fernanda. She stared at me blankly. My parents are creative. I lied and she laughed. Okay, Mafir, you're up. So part of that document that I gave you has Maria Fernanda describing this. So she says, I originally started the essay explaining why I decided to join the speech program. So she said, she basically says, I started off initially with just kind of this description and context, walking the audience through the events that led me to be sitting in front of my very first tournament round. But while editing, I realized that it took me 6 paragraphs to get to the true beginning of the story. In other words, that the story wasn't, it didn't have a sense of scene, right? So a question I would ask you here is, what do you think she means by the true beginning of the story? And maybe this is something you could address in the video workshop. You're going to get an implication of what I think she means. What I think she means is that it's not just, rather than beginning with a long description or exposition or explanation that sets up the characters and blah, 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 consider beginning, jumping, in medias res is kind of the phrase, which is in the middle of everything, right? In the middle of a moment with a detail from the mode of transformation itself, right? So Maria says, after discussing it with my teacher, I realized that the beginning was too descriptive and it wasn't pulling the reader into the world, right? It wasn't establishing a strong enough connection with my audience that would allow them to understand how I was feeling and how I had changed by the end of the essay. So one of the things I mentioned in the DV2, A Moment of Transformation, with the beginning is you want to have that sense of setup, but you want to try and do that setup, right? Setting up the norm, setting up the emotion that's going to shift, or the character sense of norm that's going to shift. And so, but doing that through a scene is much more effective because that will actually hook the reader. It'll give them that sense of, bringing them into a sense of scene, of action, of detail, right? So Maria continues, ultimately, instead of opening with a description, I decided to begin the essay with a mispronunciation of my name to communicate the fact, again, focusing in on a detail, that I am from another country in a much more dynamic way than simply stating, I am not American. By starting with a moment when the judge struggled to call me up to the front of the room, I could invite my audience to live this experience with me. So there's that living the experience. Rather than just telling the experience, you could live that experience of that discomfort of somebody mispronouncing their name, rather than her just saying, I'm not American. So there we have that sense of detail also, doing more powerful work than just describing something. Right? It allows for an enactment of a moment rather than just the sort of telling of a moment. So let's take a look at the beginning of Langston Hughes' story, Salvation. I was saved from sin when I was going on 13, but not really saved. It happened like this. There was a big revival at my Auntie Reed's church. So there we have immediately a flashback, right? And we go right into a scene. There was a big revival at my Auntie Reed's church. Every night for weeks, there had been much preaching, singing, praying, and shouting, and some very hardened sinners had been brought to Christ, and the membership of the church had grown by leaps and bounds. And just before the revival ended, they held a special meeting for children, quote, to bring the young lambs to the fold. There we get that lexicon, that diction. My aunt spoke of it for days ahead. That night, I was escorted to the front row and placed on the mourner's bench with all the other young sinners who had not yet been brought to Jesus. So we have that clear sense of a scene, of course, but we also have this sense of introducing the main character, this young person, I was saved from sin, this young character with that scene and through the details of that scene, right? So we have this sense of not only the protagonist, but we also have a sense of the kind of antagonist, which I'll get to in a second. I reminded myself, use your voice. I wanted to introduce early on in the essay. So this is going back to Maria. I wanted to introduce early on in the essay the idea that uncovering and utilizing voice is something I truly value. So here you see she's setting up that kind of norm. By establishing the sort of sacred connection I have to my voice and its meaning, my audience can better understand why I'm so heartbroken by the end of the essay. In other words, the disruption is only going to be as effective as the setup allows it to be, right? So that setup of the emotional norm is something that will change. When we look back at that salvation moment, right, he's setting up this idea of being brought into the fold, right, of this young kid who really didn't know anything about religious experience per se, and except through his aunt, right? So setting up that emotional norm that will change. My aunt told me that when you were saved, you saw a light. So here we have that norm, and something happened to you inside, and Jesus came into your life, and God was with you from then on. She said you could see and hear and feel Jesus in your soul. I believed her. I had heard a great many old people say the same thing, and it seemed to me they ought to know. So I sat there calmly in the hot, crowded church, waiting for Jesus to come to me. So notice there's this, the norm for this young kid is the anticipation, is the not knowing, is the lack of knowing, or the ignorance of religious experience and salvation. At the same time, you see here that what is set up is a kind of antagonist. Um, so taking a look at Felsenfeld's story, music may be the universal language, but those of us who spend our lives with it are expected to know it in depth from early on. Many composers, whether traditional or experimental, have been steeped in Western classical music from the cradle, excuse me. That was not the case with me. Now, we immediately dive into scene. We have a little bit of a description at the start there, but then we get into scene. My primal time was the middle of the 80s in Orange County, California. I was 17 years old. The OC was built as the ideal suburban community, but when you are raised in a palm tree lined Shangri-La, as I was, it is hard to grasp what's missing without that crucial glimpse beyond. So there's already a sense of that norm. It's hard to know what I was missing. Now I realize, even though we had enough water to keep the manicured lawns just so, I was experiencing a personal drought, an arid lack of culture of all kinds, especially music. So not only do we have that emotional norm, but we also have this sense of this antagonist. So the antagonist in Salvation, okay, well, the antagonist in Speechless, right, we very much quickly understand is Maria and the relationship with her voice, as well as this speech contest. The antagonist in Felsenfeld's story here is very much his own lack of knowledge about music, and his lack of experience of a more diverse understanding of music, an appreciation of a variety different kinds of music. In Salvation, right, like we said, that antagonist again is the kind of one's own ignorance of religious experience, but also the church is kind of the antagonist, right? Antagonist doesn't mean enemy necessarily. It means the other, or the other thing, the thing that is going to challenge the protagonist, or create that disruption. So, okay, my fear, you're up. So she says, I settled on this incorrect pronunciation of my name to add lightheartedness to the piece. And this is just, I think, is not something that is required in all openings. But she says, adding humor when appropriate is always a great strategy to diversify the tone of the essay and make it more engaging. I think we all know that life is very conflictual, if you will, when it comes to tone, right? You could be going through something horrible and something funny will happen. Now, it doesn't necessarily need to be that dramatic, but that our emotional experiences and our experiences of the world are often quite varied, right? And quite, so in order to add a sense of realism, often it's good to have different tonal shifts. If you have a story that's just entirely depressing the entire time, it doesn't mean that doesn't make for a good story. But often you want to have moments that allow for that kind of diversity, that have some sort of humor and voice, or at least bring forward some sense of style, right? So you have very much a sense of a kind of, in all these beginnings we look at, right? Right. Shangri-La, right? You have this diction that gives a kind of sense of point of view and character, or the salvation story, bringing the lambs to the fold. Um, um, I believed her. But so you have a way in which this humor, this voice, the style, we want to get that in place in the beginning early on as well. So again, with Salvation, I was saved from sin when I was going on 13, but not really saved. It happened like this. We have such a clear sense of voice, right, from those opening lines. So those are things we can think about, taking a look at a couple of the examples from the DB2, A Moment of Disruption, in our class, just to bring back, instead of beginning with a long description or exposition that sets up the moment of transformation, consider beginning with a detail from the moment of transformation itself, or just beginning within a scene, I think is really important. So here's one example from the narratives we just wrote. Just breathe, relax. This is something you've done a million times. I think to myself. I do a few quick hops, numbingly watching as Liam, The third leg of the relay quickly rounds the curves of the track. Although he has fallen into second place, there is still hope for me to make up the lost distance. So here we have that sense of not only kind of the action of a race, a relay race here, we have this sense of voiced with this sort of interior monologue. But we also have a sense of this being a metaphor for something else. We have a sense of a norm, right? There's still hope for me to make up the lost distance. There's this sense of the character needing some sort of fulfillment, needing some sort of achievement that hasn't happened yet or isn't quite there yet. Taking a look at one more and then we'll wrap up. It started with a question at only 8 years old when my parents' divorce took center stage. Constant back and forth between the judge and my parents threw them in a stalemate. It came down to the naive decision of an 8-year-old girl with no clue of the repercussions. I want mom. You would think, plain and simple, right? So here we have a shift to second person. You would think, plain and simple, right? We have that first person point of view, of course, in the rest of the story. But then we also have this quick moment of dialogue, that's quick piece, I want mom, that gives that sense of immediacy. So these details, and we get this sense of conflict, right? We set up this sense of conflict. We have a sense of sort of style, and also kind of a sense of humor, plain and simple, right? You have this sense of humor, you have this sense of style, and really sort of serves to hook the reader in. So I think some really good beginnings, but we can go back and start thinking about those beginnings, also thinking about those details and thinking about the sequencing of our narrative as different ways we can start to build from here. So that's it for now. Until next time, let me stop the share. Might take a second, but until next time, good luck with continuing to build our narratives. We're working our way towards a workshop draft of this essay, which will come clear in the next few days as I continue updating you about our class. And so I look forward to that. All right, take care.